Good morning, Ian.
Morning, Alex.
Good to see you again.
Very good. What are we talking about today? I think it's chapter 6, isn't it?
Yes, chapter
Which
6.
is on emotional and social intelligence.
Well, before we jump into it, maybe we could make some high-level comments about this journey.
Yes.
And I got some interesting feedback stating that what we're doing is working for some people, and it helps people kind of not only be interested in your book, but engage with the ideas and also seeing them being developed by you live, as it were. It's very valuable to many people, but that we should not think of this series as a substitute for the book at all. And at the same time, we may be aware that not many people have perhaps the time or the energy to literally read the whole book, but it's nevertheless, they are an invitation. And the problem here, or the challenge, is that although we try to summarize, especially you summarize every chapter, and we provide detail, that cannot compensate for actually going and reading through the book oneself. So that's something I wanted to make explicit before we begin for the people who listen to us.
Yes, well, my impression, and probably you would have something of the same impression, is that what happens when we have to talk about a chapter is a couple of things are underemphasized and not present so much. One is the sheer case studies, that the individuality of the reports of people and their experiences and their life with one or other hemisphere deficits. And I suppose the other is simply that it becomes less nuanced. So in other words, it becomes curiously more left hemisphere. It becomes more abstract and more straightforward than it is in reality. So if you really want to know the full story, and also for it to come to life, I think there is no substitute, obviously, for reading it. On the other hand, I'm sure, and that the evidence is that people do enjoy hearing us give an overview of these chapters. Yeah.
Yes, that's a very funny and I think insightful point about what we're trying to do. The danger always is that we are talking about the divide between the hemispheres falling onto one side of it. Yes. And then another remark with respect to our exchange is that I'm trying to follow you. I think I'm following you in this path, and sometimes I have a tendency to ask about this or that direction, and I'm trying not to derail us, but at the same time I cannot help it. So I'll see this as, again, short excursions we make, and sometimes I'm trying to understand better what you're saying, but also sometimes I'm asking questions. And I just wanted to say that these questions are not meant to be rhetorical, nor kind of questions asked to Professor McGilchrist for them to be answered as if this was a mathematics lecture. So in this image that I always have with you about this journey through a landscape, it's like I bring these questions in my backpack, and it's not that they're heavy like stones. Like perhaps you can think of some questions as a water bottle, and so they go with me, and I just hold them, and and we share them, I could say, because I think we share many of those questions. So I wanted to say that that's what I'm trying to do, although I may sometimes not succeed in doing it, but that's how I see it.
Oh yes, I mean I love our excursions, and I'm very willing to. I mean, I think it actually helps you to ask questions as awkward as you like. I think it makes for good, stimulating discussion, I think.
Great. Well, so should we jump into chapter 6?
Yes, let's. Yes. Well, in this chapter called Emotional and Social Intelligence, I'm exploring the different contributions of the two hemispheres to our understanding of the human world. And this is a very important part of anybody's intelligence and ability to understand, is to be able to read implicit signals, to have a sense of what is real and what is not, to be able to see another person's point of view, to be able to respond not just in the abstract, in a somewhat computer-like fashion, but using the whole of our emotional and embodied being. And if we can't take part in these exchanges, then there's something gone missing from reality. Early on in the book, I think I make this point, which probably runs like a thread through the whole thing, which is that experience is an encounter. I really think that's so important. There are two things about an encounter. One is that it's a relationship, not a thing. And it's a process that moves, not static. And on top of that, it's something that makes us understand the unique case, whereas otherwise we become too general.
When you mention understanding the human world, well, that's probably the only world we know about, in the sense that sometimes we try to be objective, or even do the opposite, which often is the same, which is to say, oh, let's not be anthropocentric or anthropomorphic. And we understand why we do that, because there's so many flaws in placing ourselves at the center of the universe. And yet we are our own centers, right? So if we don't understand the human world, which may sound as a chapter within different worlds we could understand, well, we're missing everything, because that's the world we live in. And I think it's great you start here, because that's something I read towards the end of your chapter too, like, because we're going to see the role of emotions and social intelligence. And at the end of the day, that's this kind of implicit meaning hidden in our own bodies and in the relationship with others is really all about being in the world. So it's funny, because sometimes it may sound that understanding the human world is again another discipline that's maybe sociologists or anthropologists or psychologists, but that's literally what everything is about, as I see it.
Yes, I mean, it's about how to understand the meaning of something that somebody does, their expressions, their tone of voice, the things they don't say, all that comes out that's metaphorical and implicit, all these things which really underlie our understanding, as you quite rightly say, of the whole world, since after all, we are humans. But I was meaning specifically and more the human world, because there are kinds of understanding, for example, of engineering, that don't involve a great deal of emotional and social intelligence.
Yeah.
So yes, that's a very important thing for us. Yeah.
You make a distinction right at the beginning of the chapter, also, as always, reflecting back on where we've been in the previous ones and so on. You speak about, again, of course, the right hemisphere dominating grip on reality. And then you say, well, now we're going to talk about the intuitive sense of reality. So perhaps you could unpack or move around what it's meant by this intuitive sense and how that's somewhat different, slightly different, to the kind of grip on reality. What's this intuitive sense? And also I'm curious that intuitive sense comes in a chapter that's entitled Intelligence. So here we already see that intelligence is not what we've usually been taught intelligence is.
Well, intelligence, certainly part of it, and a very important part of it, is precisely how we have been taught to imagine or understand intelligence. I'm not disparaging the kind of cognitive intelligence that, for example, IQ tests measure. And indeed, in our next session, we will be talking exactly about that. But I made the distinction because really these are quite separate things in most people's minds, and they do draw on different faculties. For example, there's nothing in cognitive intelligence as measured in IQ tests and things like that tests our grasp of reality. I use the word grasp there probably wrongly, because I have to be careful how I phrase these things. But what is very, very clear is that the right hemisphere is the one that underwrites not just aspects of that will help us create a reality, but the basic sense of reality itself. And in fact, at the beginning of that chapter, I don't know if I can, let me see if I can find it. There's something rather interesting, because I wonder if people think somehow that I make this stuff up and nobody else really believes it. I quote from a 2017 paper by Gurin and Blum, and they have an in-depth, using their words, survey of right hemisphere functions, and it confirms the drift of the previous chapters that we've discussed, namely that the right hemisphere's mode of attention, capacity for pragmatic understanding and communication, superior perceptual integration, and ability to shift belief appropriately in the light of new evidence all make possible what the authors of that paper refer to as the right hemisphere dominated grip on reality, a grip that becomes increasingly tenuous, these are their words, the more impaired these functions become. So I would absolutely agree with that. These are people who've provided, as they say, an in-depth overview. And I start the chapter actually with talking about not just aspects of reality, but the sense of reality itself. And particularly interesting to me is that in, for example, John Cutting's survey of delusions and the right hemisphere or left hemisphere, he talks about some delusions as arising from dysfunction of the left hemisphere. They're much fewer. They're something like 23% overall of the ones that he reports. And the 77% that follow on right hemisphere damage are not only more numerous, but more extreme and more troubling. But one really fascinating thing is that when you come to look at what these distortions are, they're very simple. For example, the visual hallucinations are not really hallucinations as we described, where people see completely new aspects of reality, something different that an observer would not see. But they're also they're simply things like a tilt of the angle of vision or a change of the angle of vision. Something, in other words, that's to do with the framework rather than the actual reality that's being discussed. So although he has those 22%, they're much less like what we would normally think of as either delusions or hallucinations than the ones that follow on right hemisphere damage. And two of the ones that he describes, which were distortions of reality following on left hemisphere damage, two of them are increased sense of reality. So with the left hemisphere damage, people say it's hard to say, but the thing seems much more real than usual. The colors, the forms, their experience is somehow clearer and more direct than it was when the left hemisphere was functioning. So that's a very good point to make at the outset.
Yes. And it's very useful distinction or precision you make about the aspects of reality and the sense. That helps me understand why you make that statement at the beginning. We're not going to be talking about features, but literally the sense of reality. And with respect to your last comment, and I don't want to, again, get us off track, but I've been thinking too about ways in which the right hemisphere function may be enhanced in a way that we are even more gripping onto reality. And a very simple experience that I have and that everybody can have is when you wake up from, night sleep, but it happens to me after a siesta, when I have the luxury of sleeping a siesta. And the first few minutes, especially if I was very tired and I had a good rest for an hour, let's say, in Spain, we're set to sleep long siestas. It lasts for a few minutes, but there is this acute and clear and even lucid sense of just being there in the world. And probably it doesn't need to be necessarily what we're talking about, but I'm insisting that in our everyday life, it's not just neurology or weird cases. In our everyday life, we have opportunities to kind of taste these states with respect to reality.
Indeed, and that's a very good point to make. I think probably in that sort of liminal state in which one's waking up, one does see things more clearly. But it's hard to assess that because one's mental state at the time is unusual. But we know this through the experience of patients who've had left hemisphere strokes. I quote a pilot who reported that after a left hemisphere stroke, everything looked more real, more alive, more beautiful. The hedgerows, the birds, the light, the trees, everything had this greater intensity. And Jill Bolter-Taylor has similar reports that after having had a left hemisphere stroke, she saw this world in a more, what seemed like a heightened sense of reality, but probably it's simply more in touch with reality than when the brain is functioning as a whole.
Yes. Okay, so should we talk about emotions? Because that's what most of the chapter is about. Unless you want to comment more about these first paragraphs where you talk about, yes, the sense of reality, unreality, abnormality, or the anomalous. Well, these categories of ways of being real, you mentioned as well, déjà vu and this unique familiarity, but that's probably what you were alluding to a moment ago. Because very, very soon after that, you say, well, in being in touch with reality, we need to talk about the body, although that's not going to be unfolded too much in this chapter. The implicit, which is going to be central. I think we're going to come to it at the end of the chapter. And then emotions and connections with others. So perhaps we could continue there.
No. Well, I think I'd like to talk about those things, but I think you mentioned déjà vu there, and I'm sure probably everybody has had this experience of déjà vu at some time, where you feel suddenly that this situation, the whole of this situation, is familiar to you, and has happened, and you have a feeling that you know what's going to happen next. Although quite probably if you were asked, you wouldn't be able to articulate it. But that's that sense, and its converse, jamais vu. This is completely something, although it is in reality familiar, is completely unfamiliar to me. These are both consequent on right hemisphere lesions. One of the difficulties here, and I do address this in detail in the chapter, is that some kinds of abnormalities can diminish the activity of the area, obviously, but some kinds, epileptiform activity, can enhance the activity of the area. So if you have an area of damage in the brain, obviously one normally thinks this, whatever function is underwritten by this area of the brain, is going to be impaired, relatively absent. That is generally true. But if there is epileptic activity associated with that area, then it's as though it's overexcited and it's kind of producing more of what it would normally do. Now, sometimes one can't be absolutely certain, but I go through the cases where there are hints as to which of these two things is happening. I don't think we can exactly do that now, but for those who are puzzled over that question, I do address it in this chapter.
Yes.
And then I suppose, yes, I mean, those are the things to do with the sense of reality itself. I ought to mention here that schizophrenia, which, as I said before, and will no doubt say again, mimics to a very large extent a right hemisphere deficit state. In schizophrenia, it's very common for subjects to have this sense that nothing is real. And so if they're in hospital, they will be quite convinced that the doctors and nurses are just play acting. They're not really doctors and nurses. And that indeed the ward is a stage set in which everything is just being played out for their benefit. And that's really quite a strange sense to have, but is also described after certain kinds of right hemisphere deficit states. So I'm sure that in the case of what is seen in schizophrenia, of this heightened sense of abnormality or lowered sense of the reality, this is dependent on right hemisphere dysfunction. Yes, there's something called theory of mind, which is the ability to understand what's going on in another creature's mind. I say creature because until recently it was thought that only human beings had this capacity to understand that another person knows things or may know things that you don't know, or that they may not know things that you do know. This is a capacity which was thought to be confined to human beings, and then only to human beings after the age of 4. But we now know that elements of this exist much earlier in child development, and that this capacity is shared with not only the great apes and monkeys, but also with many animals, such as seals, and even crows and magpies have this ability to understand. That's interesting because in schizophrenia it's often absent, and in autism it's very regularly absent. And people who have right hemisphere damage find it very difficult to interpret or understand what other people are saying. And there are a number of aspects to this. One is the ability to read a face, body language, to understand tone of voice, to understand irony, sarcasm, to be able to understand the meaning of a metaphor, not to take it literally. And in brief, people with right hemisphere damage become literalistic in the way in which they interpret things. And if you actually were to study a conversation, a recorded conversation, you'd find that we're constantly using metaphors. And if you take them literally, it doesn't seem to make any sense at all.
Well, talking about theory of mind, I can help to think the great efforts that biologists and neuroscientists do in order to get into the minds of the creatures they study in the laboratory. And that would, of course, apply outside the lab and also with our fellow humans, right, or pets. But it's timely because there is this trend or higher awareness or sensitivity today, I would say, as to this range of minds that are in biology, in animals, of course, but also in plants and fungi. I mean, over the last year, there's been a resurgence. It was always there, but maybe it's reaching more the general awareness that animals have minds, of course, but also that plants are cognitive organisms too, and the amazing roles that fungi, other kingdoms of life have. And still it often is presented as maybe a 6 impossible things before breakfast, like really an impossible feat of us from our mind really having a sense of the minds of other creatures. Nevertheless, it's again both important as scientists, but also in our daily lives, as to what can we sense, what's this empathy we have, ability to receive those minds and also to express our own.
Yes, well, you're referring there to stuff that I'll be covering and we'll be talking about in the chapter on matter and consciousness, where I point to evidence that, as you say, we have to take into account the possibility, the likelihood, not only that other animals, but even plants have something very, very close to an awareness, and I believe that it is an awareness. I mean, it's almost to do violence to language to suggest it isn't an awareness of things that they can weigh, they can respond in ways that can't be simply programmed and are not part of their experience, but they can even think, if you like, of a way of reacting, which is not preordained in any way. And you're also, when you talk about fungi, I'm sure you're referring to the huge success that Merlin Sheldrake has had with his book Entangled Life, which has done a great deal to sophisticate people's understanding of other forms of life and what they're capable of.
Yes, absolutely.
Yes.
And this idea of an ecology, I'm just to point out this idea that there's an ecology of minds out there and in here, and this chapter is perhaps a way to start approaching that realization that books like Merlin's and others are putting on the table, and we realize what we perhaps always knew, that the world is filled with other minds and the skills and needed to be able to relate to those minds in a way that's not damaging to us or those minds.
Yes, indeed. Maybe we should talk about emotion, because you did talk about some empathy there. And about that, we're not so certain. Although animals clearly do show empathy, particularly the great apes and monkeys, in some rather horrible experiments carried out in the 1960s. Monkeys would prefer to starve for days than to give an electric shock to another monkey, which would release food for them, because that was something that they found very distressing. And there are many examples of animals helping other animals, not just kin, not only that, but not even of the same species, to intervene in order to save their lives or to help them. So, as I often say, the story of evolution as undiluted competition is an error, because probably even more than competition, which is certainly required, is cooperation. And many species, probably the majority, have evolved through a matter of cooperation, which also includes it with the environment. So, as you were saying, there's a sense in which these understandings are ecological. As Gibson points out, the landscape, the environment around the creature is not, strictly speaking, entirely separate from the creature. What it has is evoked by the creature and so forth.
Well, to me, just, and I want to go back to emotions now, but to me, this just, again, reminds me of the idea that when we're talking about the world, which is a central word and concept idea in your book, we're talking about self-awareness, but we're talking about others, and we're talking about intersubjectivity. So all of those are aspects of the world. And by talking about emotional intelligence and social intelligence, we are again making explicit the key importance of those relations. This is not accessory, like secondary imposed relations on things, but the very fabric of what we're talking about is relational.
It is, absolutely. Even in a metaphysical sense, as you know, I believe that everything exists as a relationship, and that relationships exist prior to the things that appear to be related. But when it comes to sentient beings, this is certainly an inescapable conclusion. One of the things I thought I would mention, because people sort of suggest that people think that you mustn't attribute consciousness to creatures other than ourselves, because we can't get inside them in some way to find out whether they are, or to know what kind of thing they're experiencing. But if they are experiencing, then in a way they must have something akin to what we're talking about. And in that relation, until the 1980s, as I was shocked to learn when I was training as a doctor, operations used to be carried out on small infants without anesthetics, because it was thought, well, they hadn't got the faculties to experience things in the way that we do, which to me is absolutely shocking, but is part of this unwillingness to accept that anything other than an adult human being can feel what we can feel. In a way, it's a failure of imagination. It's because one can't prove in some way that another creature has this, even though the signs are that they do. One will rigorously insist that they don't until it's been proven to you. This is something that can't be ultimately proven one way or another. But that's perhaps taking us into another area which we will come to and look at in greater depth.
Yes, let's go back to emotional considerations and your refinement proposal of kind of an alternative theory of this kind of easy but incorrect and too simplistic way of summarizing the whole thing as one hemisphere does emotion and the other one does cool rational thinking. I mean, you correct that and refine it, and also you can talk about, I was very curious to read about anger, irritability, and disgust as the exception that kind of refines this view of emotions in the brain.
Yes, that's right. And a very good place to start is with the idea of this cool, rational, unemotional left hemisphere. Is the left hemisphere both cognitively tends to jump to conclusions, and emotionally tends towards anger and irritability. So anger is one of the most clearly lateralized of all emotions, and it lateralizes to the left hemisphere, not the right. So both hemispheres are able to experience and underwrite emotions. Are there any differences? It's one of the theories that's enjoyed currency for several decades now is the idea of the approach withdrawal model, in which the left hemisphere underwrites emotions that are associated with approaching something, some creature, some situation, and the right hemisphere, by contrast, with emotions associated with withdrawal. There are a number of difficulties here, but several overarching reviews of the area show that if anything, it's the other way around, and certainly enough examples of emotions which are really emotions of approach that are underwritten by the right hemisphere and not by the left. What I note is we need to be able to discriminate, because there are differences between the emotional capacities of the two hemispheres. And one way of looking at this is that, in keeping with the left hemisphere's desire for cooperation, for understanding, for empathy, for social bonding, the emotions associated with it, such as sadness, compassion, guilt, are associated with the right hemisphere, and those that are associated with social rivalry, such as irritability, anger, and disgust, are associated with the left hemisphere. This not only makes complete sense, but is in accord with the, in the best possible, in the greatest degree, with the available scientific information.
And these most visible eruptive emotions like anger contrast, as you're saying, with emotional depth. And from depth, I want to go to the idea of the implicit again, right? Of course, all emotions can be made explicit, and probably that's also the raison d'etre, but at the same time, there's something very interesting about the less noisy emotions. And also we could even talk about irony and sarcasm, and the fact that they convey something implicit that cannot be just presented with the full force of the light of the day. And maybe from there we can talk about metaphors. Maybe it's too big of a jump, because we're talking about emotions, and one could say, well, what do metaphors have to do with emotion? But metaphors are really a good case to discuss this slate of mind where there's something that's metaphorical, but then it's understood as literal in a way. Or the other way to put it would be the problems in understanding the non-literal aspect, the implicit aspect as well, of human affairs. And that has ramifications for everyday life, but I would also like to talk maybe in a few minutes about metaphors in our scientific understanding of the universe.
Yes. The business of implicit understanding has many aspects to it, and you're quite right that metaphors are one form of implicit understanding, which is richer than any explicit expression, which is why metaphor is a crucial aspect of poetry, but we'll come to that. The ability to read a face we know that the right hemisphere is better at recognizing a particular face as belonging to a certain person, also making judgments about which sex the face belongs to, and it also is much better at reading signals, which may be very fleeting indeed, very short-lived signs in the eyes, which just a few hundredths of a second can be read by the right hemisphere, but the left hemisphere is not able to do this. Also, the whole business of posture, the business of prosody, which is the inflection of the voice, the way in which one modulates what one says, these are all highly dependent on the right hemisphere. And after people have right hemisphere strokes, they tend to become very monotonal in their way of speaking. They also become very literal minded, and this is where we come to the metaphor thing, that people have tested both right and left hemisphere damaged people with the ability to understand metaphorical meaning. And the quite extraordinary finding is that those with right hemisphere damage are very bad at understanding metaphorical meaning. That's okay. But the left hemisphere damage are even better at understanding metaphorical meaning than normal subjects, which is quite remarkable, at least in some studies.
We could think about the etymology of the word intelligence, which is what we're talking about, types of intelligence. And well, I used to create my own etymology by saying, well, it's intus legere, which is like reading into things, which maybe intuition is also too. But if you check the proper etymology, it's interlegere, and inter is between, and legere is right to choose, but also to care. So we're talking about the same thing again, but from a different perspective. What are we talking about when we talk about intelligence?
Yes. Well, you're quite right to emphasize the root of interledgery, because it's inter meaning between or among, as you rightly say. Because in many respects, what we are understanding is in those interstices that you referred to. This is certainly how poetry works, but it's also how narratives in novels work. The mind is always making connections, looking at the interactions of people, of words, of ideas. And then the work itself, at another level, is communicating between the writer and the reader in order to understand. And interesting, the word under in understand doesn't mean beneath, but it means among. It comes from an old use of under, which is the same as the German unter. Unter can mean underneath, but it can mean among. And understanding is to not, I was always puzzled by why you're standing under something. It's not that you're standing among and between things in order to understand the entire context. And these contextual aspects are missing when people have right hemisphere damage, and context completely changes what it is you're looking at. The tone of voice may completely turn on its head what the words in isolation appear to be saying. So being aware of all these things is part of how we not just understand things. I mean, people may think emotional and social understanding, well, if I don't go to too many parties, it doesn't matter. But it's not confined to that at all. It's confined to making sense of anything we experience in which human beings are acting and speaking. So it's important for a politician, it's important for a judge, it's important for anyone who is carrying out any sophisticated assessment of a situation that involves human beings. Unless you have this capacity, you're going to completely misinterpret what you're looking at. Yes. And a thing that concerns me at the moment is that very often in social media and in other ways of talking about our society, we're being presented with something that is so reduced in respect of its emotional and social intelligence that it is just a sort of almost like a set of equations or algorithms that could be made to work in a computer. And we are forced to interact with machines, and in doing so become more machine-like. I mean, this is a topic we can't possibly go into here because it would take us too long, but it is something that concerns me very greatly.
Yes, and in talking about the relationship between the difficult relationship between information and meaning, you also speak about literalism. So perhaps you could devote a few more minutes to talk about the kind of the fallacy of literalism. And as you were helping me understand, because I always was puzzled too by the idea of understanding as if it was a building and something in between. It's less architectonic and more, again, like fungi. I was thinking that literalism is a kind of the arid soil of the mind. I mean, you need stones, but the soul has to be living. And when we push this idea of giving primacy to the literal and thinking of the metaphorical as some sort of tale or myth in a dismissive way, we're kind of making this soil of thinking and mind arid. So
yes, I mean, very important is the fact that metaphor is not an addition or an ornament at the top level. After you've said what you, quote, really mean, then you can dress it up poetically in a metaphor. But actually, it's not a superficial covering of language. It is the bedrock of language. All language is making a connection between a symbol and experience. And in doing so, it has to do it via effectively metaphors. And no language is more reliant on metaphor than scientific and philosophical discourse. And I give some examples in there of words that we pass over that have a metaphorical meaning. And it's through that metaphor. Metaphor means carrying over. It's like forming a bridge between a world of symbols, a world of theory, and the world that we actually experience in daily life. So it's intrinsically the basis of how we understand the world, not just from a social or emotional way, but any form that involves language. Whenever we're using language, we're using metaphor. However, there is another layer to the idea of metaphor, because most metaphors that we use and rely on, we don't experience them as metaphors when we speak them, because we've become so familiar with them that they've lost any element of shock. You know, in a way, the connection between one part of a metaphor and another is like a spark of electricity that joins two things. Normally, when we're using metaphorical expressions, they're so dead because they're so familiar that we don't realize that they're metaphors at all. In other words, they don't act as metaphors anymore. They don't carry meaning across any implied gap. But when we are aware, when a metaphor is used as it is in poetry, this is where the right hemisphere is super important. And much of the literature on hemisphere difference in metaphors has been confused by the fact that people haven't distinguished between cliches, because some metaphors are simply cliches, and a live metaphor in which it is doing the work of joining two things together. And this is a beautiful example of a very clear distinction. If you take out the so-called metaphors that are just cliches, the left hemisphere deals with them, because it always deals with the cliche, the worn, the familiar, the known, things that, as it were, it feels safe with. Whereas the live metaphor is very much dependent on the right hemisphere. And it's also the right hemisphere that helps us to understand irony, sarcasm, and is at the root of laughter and sadness and all these emotions that
And
are
this is
emotions, the social emotions,
thanks for making
empathic emotions. Yeah.
Yes, thanks for making this point. Now it was a perfect kind of next step, because in the book, and this is again an invitation for the listeners to read the book, because this is the sort of nuances that I think one must read, because you go in this chapter, there's a moment where you say, well, I need to make some clarifications as to the science and the disputes and the misunderstanding regarding metaphors. And then you talk about the attempt to locate the areas of the brain and whether they're active and what it means that they're active and what else we should look for. And you engage in this constructive dialogue with the references there to see, well, that's all very nice, but now still we could be totally confused, precisely because we're talking about fresh metaphors, or sometimes we're talking about reified or kind of literalized ones. And that's something where, again, we move from common sense to philosophy, but then immediately back to the hemispheres and current research. So that would be a good point for the reader for the listener to go and read exactly how you say it and what you say there.
Yes, there's obviously more there than we can cover now. But one thing that I rather like, because it makes the point both amusingly and acutely, this point I'm making between the cliche and the live connection. When you have a metaphor such as rain clouds are pregnant ghosts, which is obviously not a cliche, it's a new way of thinking, that is very much the right hemisphere's take. But when you have an everyday phrase that is in fact metaphorical, it can be very funny when you take it literally. It's not any longer thought to be literal. This is the inverse of what you have to see the hidden meaning. Here, we're so used to the hidden meaning that we have to see the explicit meaning. So let me give an example. there's an English comedian called Milton Jones who uses a lot of this as a way of creating humor. So I remember him saying, you know, when my dad was nearing death, he asked us to rub his back with lard. After that, he went downhill fast. It's just so beautiful. And when you do this inversion of a cliched phrase in order to see a hidden meaning, which is actually the literal meaning, the right hemisphere again is the one that is engaging with it. So that clarifies that what the right hemisphere is doing is always understanding the hidden aspect of this. It's not just that it's able to do metaphor, which it is, but it's further than that. It's this ability to see links between the tired, the worn, the fatigued, the flat in our language, and some other meaning which is vibrant and alive, as we say, it's alive.
And it reminds me of this important point about switching that we've discussed nearly in every chapter, right? It's not just a division, but the ability not to be stuck there. So when we tend to think of something, which virtually we always do in terms of a metaphor, let's bring the brain again. Is it the computer? Is it not? It maybe more than discussing to what extent it is or it is not, it's to me, it's very helpful to just dress it with another metaphor and go back and say, well, they used to think, well, Cajal thought of it in a more natural way as trees and plants and gardens, but you could even conceive a brain as a prism, and then the light coming in and the light refracting and diffracting. It's just entertain that for a moment, and then go back to your favorite metaphor, which for most people is the computer, unfortunately. But then that computer metaphor, perhaps it's more alive because it's like going on a holidays or going for the weekend to the countryside. You come back to your place and now your place still familiar, but it's more alive. So this exercise is like just gymnastics from one metaphor to another, maybe insufflates them with some life. And then the very same tiresome metaphor has a different, I mean, it works with me because I don't like the computer metaphor. I think it's incorrect and misleading and even dangerous. But by doing this exercise, I come back to it and I can see that it has some aspects that help thought. The problem is when you're stuck in it, as we've discussed, when you would be stuck in there and not able to switch, and then you start confabulating and don't knowing and negating you don't know and not realizing that you don't know. So we're back to this catch-22.
Yes, and another factor there is that the right hemisphere is much more able to be flexible, so to move through different points of view and perhaps using different images or models, which is what you're recommending, really, that we try these different ways of thinking. The model that you referred to, which used to be a very important one until perhaps the last 100 years, was that of an organism, which it is, that, you know, that the brain has the structure of certain things that are arboreal, you know, that it's like an organism. It's like, in fact, a group of organisms. It's more like Merlin's collection of creatures that are working together and can't really be seen as entirely separate. And our own being has these qualities. Of course, you know that for me, the more important metaphor, the most important metaphor of all, is that of a flowing, something like a river. But we'll come back to that when we talk about the biology and the metaphors used by biologists.
Yes.
But yes, probably it's worth just saying here that it might well be thought that the left hemisphere was, reliable and so on, and the right hemisphere was somehow rather too prone to emotion. Yeah, okay, it may be. People might say, yes, it may be good at interpreting emotions. It may be better than the left hemisphere at expressing them and at receiving them, which is the case. But perhaps that means the right hemisphere is just sort of inappropriately emotional. But actually, it's the right hemisphere that is also the one that inhibits emotion. And this is why anger is one of the most difficult emotions to inhibit, because it's largely based in the left hemisphere, and it's harder for that emotion to be inhibited by the right frontal area.
Start wrapping up, I think, because as you end the chapter making this remark that sometimes when we say, well, being emotional sounds like being dysregulated or unregulated, but actually, except for that one, anger, most of what it is about is being engaged and engage with the world. And so here we are, able to comprehend it and able to interact with it and understand it. And so it's about belonging to where we belong, which is the world. So I thought as I was reading this, this is a praise for you, but you're kind of a concept healer. How, you're what you're doing is some sort of activism, but it's not necessarily political. It's kind of mental activism where you're taking all these concepts and you're, in my view, you're kind of healing them, because now we don't understand emotion as we may by kind of a reflex arc, but now emotion has all these nuance around, which is kind of, well, it's briefly how you conclude the chapter. I'm putting more into it that what's actually explicitly there, but that's how I see the chapter end, this importance of even like a feminine energy, like this idea of implicit meaning, and realizing that that's if I can say, the kind of the primordial aspect of the world, and how much we lose. Well, we lose everything if we disregard it. And so that's what came to mind when I was reading. Let's be careful when we have this knee-jerk, this response about being emotional, because emotion is about engagement with the world.
Yes, thanks very much for that, because I think that is a good place to end, because it leads towards our next discussion, which will be about cognitive intelligence. But the point that I think is so important is that emotional intelligence and cognitive intelligence, although they can be quite clearly demarcated and distinguished, are ultimately not ever separate. And people who lack emotional and social intelligence do some very unintelligent things because they don't have any of the intuitions about life and about people, about situations. They rely only on explicit elements that can be understood in a linear fashion, and they completely misunderstand what people are talking about when they are making remarks about life, because they lack the emotional intelligence which underwrites cognitive intelligence. Cognitive intelligence, as many people have pointed out, is rooted in emotional intelligence. And Antonio Damasio describes a patient of his, Elliot, who had damaged the right hemisphere and who had to, in a manner, explicitly calculate all the situations he was in so that he didn't misunderstand, and he couldn't bring this calculation to an end. So I think what you've commented on there is very important, because it's about the value of intuition for intelligence, except perhaps in some very technical area where really all you're being asked to do is to understand the relations of symbols to other symbols. But as soon as that has to be brought back into contact with real life, something important is missing. And actually, I think that's an aspect of our society now, that theory is overtaking reality. We're more willing to stick to a theory that all our experience and all our intuitions tell us is wrong than we are to say, but by knowing, by language, by experience, by intuition, I can see that this position in this theory is a mistake. Somehow we don't have the confidence anymore to do that.
Well, hopefully by meditating on this, the thing can reverse itself. It's still sort of a mystery to me as the process by which that happens, right? But in any case, it happens. So
it does. Yes. Very good. Well, thank you. And we'll be back next time looking at chapter 7 on cognitive intelligence.
Yes. Thank you very much, Iain.